Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for module number 6. This is our introduction to what's called harmonization. So we'll first define the term harmonization, then we'll work on how to understand the principles of chord progressions, which include models like the harmonic function model, sequence model, and the circle progression model. And then we'll work on how to choose harmonies that create convincing chord progressions. So let's talk about what we're trying to do overall. We're trying to do something called harmonization. And harmonization is just the process of adding chords to a melody. And there are two things to think about when choosing a chord for a melody note. And that is that melody note should be part of the chord that you pick. So in general, we'll talk about exceptions to this, but in general, the melody notes should be in the chord that you pick to harmonize with that melody note. And then the chord that you pick should also fit into a chord progression, so conventional and convincing chord progression. And that's the part we're going to focus on today. So let's look at this short melody and see which chords work for each melody note. So this is kind of working on the first part of that little two-part thing. So this is the key of G major, and our dumb little melody is just this. Okay, pretty straightforward, but you know, we gotta start small here. So this is the key of G, and we're gonna just kind of consider what chords would work with each note here. And we're just gonna stick to triads to keep it simple. And you'll see that there are still a lot of possibilities with triads. So if that G were the root of a chord, then we could use a 1 chord, because a 1 chord is a G major chord. If that G were the third of a triad, then the chord we could use would be a 6 chord, right? Because that's an E minor chord, and E minor has G as its third. And then the other possibility is that G could be the 5th of a 4 chord, so the 5th of a C major chord. So all three of those chords would work with that melody note. So just right off the bat, with one note, we have 3 possibilities to choose from. Okay, and then in the next beat, those same chords would work since that's the same note. Here, if that E were the root of a chord, root of a triad, that would be the 6th chord, an E minor chord. If that E were the third of a chord, that would be a C major chord, which is 4 in G major. And if that E were the 5th of a chord, then we could use a 2 chord, because a 2 chord is an A minor chord, and A minor has the 5th of E. Okay, so again, 3 possibilities there. And the possibilities for that F sharp are the 7 chord, the 5 chord, and the 3 chord. And then of course getting back to the 1 chord there on that G. So you can use any of those 3 chords on each of those notes, because that satisfies our first rule. Those chords all harmonize, right? They all have a note in the melody that belongs in the chord. So how do we choose which of these chords to use? And this comes to the second part of that little list, which is we need to choose chords that fit into a chord progression. Okay? And the book calls them convincing chord progressions. So conventional, or chord progressions that are normal, right? That we've all kind of grown accustomed to hearing. So there are a lot of different models for creating these convincing chord progressions, and we'll focus on 3 models. And the first of those models is going to be called harmonic function. And the next one is called circle progressions. And the final one we'll look at are sequences. Okay, and these are just different ways of choosing which chords to pick out of all those possibilities. So here's that list of possibilities again. And we're going to talk first about what these 3 methods have in common. And essentially what they're trying to do is carve out a path, right? Create a path that begins on the 1 chord. Okay, so we're always going to start on a 1 chord, and we're always going to end on a 1 chord. Okay? And the question then is, since we've started on 1 and we're going to end on 1, is which chords come in between that 1 on our way back to 1 again. Okay? And let's talk a little bit about why we go 1 to 1. That 1 chord, or in minor it's a lowercase 1, is called the tonic harmony. And you might have learned this in ear training, and I think we talked a little bit about it last semester. but we called this chord the one chord of the tonic chord. And so in the key of G major, that's the chord G. Right? Okay. So when a chord progression returns to that chord, it sounds like the music has come to a point of rest. So I can kind of just play some chords, and you'll hear that the ones that are not the tonic don't sound like they're very restful, right? So that did not end on the tonic, but when I go to the tonic, it feels like it's a point of rest. So the other chords in the progression create a feeling of harmonic tension. So any chord that's not the tonic creates a sense of tension, right? Something that feels like or sounds like it needs to keep going to resolve. And the tonic chords create a feeling of harmonic release and rest. And this is kind of what we're after with our chord progressions. It's this constant movement between tension and rest that makes the music interesting to listen to. And that's why our chord progressions focus on starting on 1, creating tension with other chords, and then ending back on 1. And that's what all 3 of these will be doing. Okay, so let's talk about one way to organize this, and this is called harmonic function. And this is a way of carving out a path to and from the 1 chord by giving each other chord in the key a specific job to do. Okay? So in other words, every chord in the key has a function in the chord progression. We already talked about one of them, which is the tonic function, and these are just any chords that will sound like they're at rest. We also have dominant function chords, and these chords, their job is to lead us back to the tonic. So they're designed, they sound like they point the way back to any tonic chords. And then we have other chords that have a subdominant function, and their job is to usually lead to the dominant, but they also have kind of a weak motion back to the tonic. So they can lead back to the tonic too, just in a different and weaker kind of way. So let's talk about which chords have tonic function. So these are the chords that sound like they're at rest. Okay? And tonic function chords sound like they're at rest, but they can also lead to any other chord. So since they're sort of the central chord, they can really go anywhere. So any other chord can follow a tonic chord. And in the key of G, right, this is the G major chord. The key of G minor would be the G minor chord, right? So it's the 1 chord in a major key. But also, we consider the 6th chord to have a similar tonic function. In fact, the 6 has 2 out of the 3 of the same notes as the 1 chord. So it has a very similar sound to the 1 chord. So we have kind of 2 tonic function chords. The 1 is the strongest, right? That's the most at rest. But the 6 also sort of sounds like it's at rest too. Right? It's also pretty stable, pretty restful. So those are our 2 tonic function chords. Their job is to end progressions or maybe begin progressions, but sound like a place of rest. Okay? And now you can switch, any of these chords can be followed by any other chord of the same category. So you can have a chord progression that goes 1 to 6 or 6 to 1. That works too. Okay, let's talk about dominant function chords. And these are chords that move back to the tonic. Okay? And in a major key, primarily the most important one is the 5 chord. So that was 5 to 1. So that 5 chord sounds like it needs to lead back to the 1, and that's the classic movement, the classic function of harmony is dominant to tonic. Other chords that also have a dominant sound are the 7 chord, and again, that's because it has 2 out of the 3 same notes as the 5 chord, so it's a very similar sound. And then we'll learn later that the 1-6-4 chord also has a sort of dominant function. So those are 3 examples of dominant function chords, chords that want to push us back to the tonic. And then let's look at another category of chords called the subdominant function chords. And these are chords that either move us to the dominant or lead us in a weak kind of way, right? In a less abrupt or softer, less strong way back to the tonic. And so they'll either lead to the dominant or lead us back to the tonic. And these are chords like the 4 chord. Okay? The 4 chord is primarily the one that moves most often back to 1, but sometimes the other chord, 2 chord, can do that too. So they either lead us back to 1 or they lead us to the dominant. They have 2 different directions they can go. Their main job is to create the first movement of tension away from the 1 chord, really. Okay, so we have almost every chord here. We have 1, 2, 4, 6, and 5. And remember, one more reminder, you can go from any chord in the same category to any other chord. So in subdominant, right, you could go from a 4 to a 2 as a chord progression. That would work fine. You can go from a 5 to a 7. That would work fine. You can go from a 1 to a 6, right? So you can move anywhere you want inside that little circle there. Otherwise, you have to connect to other circles. So we have almost all the chords here except for the 3 chord. And the 3 chord in a major key is kind of the weird one that doesn't really fit in anywhere. So we call it the mediant function, which just means the middle function. And so the 3 chord, the mediant, primarily acts as a link between the 1 chord and the 4 chord. And that's usually how you'll see it in this model. Okay? It sort of doesn't happen very often as part of this harmonic function model, but it does happen sometimes, and when it does, we say it has a mediant function, which means it leads from 1 to 3 itself, and then leads on to 4. Okay, that's probably the most complicated ones. The other ones will be a little bit simpler. But let's look at chord progressions based on using these harmonic function as a model. So here's our same melody with the same chords, chord possibilities as before. And we're going to use harmonic function to decide which chords we want to use for each melody note. So we'll put a T under the 1 chords because those are the tonic function chords. So that's where we're going, or sorry, that's where we're starting, and that's where we're going to. And we'll kind of work our way back. So the chord that needs to lead to a tonic is a dominant chord. So which one of those chords could be a dominant chord? Well, it could be the 7, and it could be the 5, but it could not be the 3, because 3 is mediant, not dominant. So the only 2 chords we can use are the 7 or the 5. And then what kind of chord leads to a dominant chord? Well, a subdominant chord does, right? And the subdominant chords for this melody note are either 2 or 4, but not 6. So now our possibilities are only 2 or 4. And then for this one, we could have chosen to do subdominant, but I chose to do tonic. And so which ones are going to be tonic? Either 6 or 1. So now we've cut down the possibilities. And at this point, you can kind of choose which ones you like best and which ones are best musically, right? So I'm going to choose to have just major triads at the end. So I'll have a 5 chord for my dominant, a 4 chord for my subdominant, and I'll give a little bit of variety with that minor chord 6 for the 2nd chord there. So you end up with this progression. Tonic, tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic. So that's how you use harmonic function to kind of carve your path from a 1 chord to another 1 chord. All right, well, harmonic function is not the only model. Another way to create a path to the tonic is to use a circle progression. And a circle progression is based on our old friend, the circle of fifths. So this is what we use to memorize key signatures. But we don't need to worry about all the other stuff in there to use a circle progression. All that happens is that a circle progression is derived from moving along the edge of the circle of fifths from one note to the next. So let's see how that works. So instead of using the different keys, right, each one being a different key, we're going to pretend that each of those notes is the root of a different chord, but they're all going to be within a single key. So let's stick with G major, and we'll say that G major is our tonic, our home key, right? So that'll be the 1 chord. Now, if I follow the circle of fifths, the chord that leads to the G chord would be the next one to the right, which would be the D chord, right? So that's 5-1. That's also really similar to the harmonic function. Well, what chord would lead to the 5 chord following this path? That would be a chord with the root A, which in the key of G is an A minor chord, so that would be the 2 chord. And then the chord that would lead to A along the circle of fifths would be the 6 chord, an E minor chord. And then the chord that would lead to the 6 following the circle of fifths, the circle progression, would be a 3 chord, so the chord on B. So this is just a way of creating a different path to the 1 chord. We call it a circle progression. And if I wrote it without following that circle there, I would just say 3 leads to 6, 6 leads to 2, 2 leads to 5, and 5 leads to 1. So if I played that, it sounds pretty convincing. Now, you don't have to use every part of the circle progression. In fact, sometimes just 2-5-1 is enough, or just 6-2-5-1 is enough to create a good chord progression. You don't have to use all of it, but it is possible to follow it all the way out to the 3 chord. Okay, so let's look at our melody again and see if we can use the circle progression model to pick the chords this time. So remember, it can go 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, and we can just use part of that if we want to. So that second to last chord again can be a 1 because that leads to it can be a 5 because that leads to 1 in our circle progression. And then the chord that we can use to get to the 5 would be the chord 2 because that leads to 5. And then the chord we can use to lead to 2 would be 6. So our chord progression using the circle progression model could be 1, 6, 2, 5, 1. Okay. Before it was something like 1, 6, 4, 5, 1, right? But now we've used the circle progression to create a different sound, but a chord progression that still works using a different model. All right, and then the last one we'll look at is something called a sequence. And first we need to understand what a sequence is. And a sequence is just a repetition of a musical idea at a new pitch level. So a sequence can be melodic, right? So this is an example of a melodic sequence. So the first little phrase of this is the statement of a musical idea. Then all that happens is that it gets moved down. It starts on a different pitch level. It starts on a G instead of an A. And you can see that all of the intervals between the notes are the same. So sequence is just taking this melody and repeating it, but not repeating it on the same note, repeating it a note down or a note up. So that's a melodic sequence. Sequences can also be harmonic. If you look at this chord progression, and you examine the chords, you'll see that we have a chord movement from F to C, which is down a perfect fifth, down a perfect fourth, and then C to D, which is up a step. Then that repeats. We have D to A, which is down a perfect fourth, and then up a step to B flat. So this is an example of a sequence that is harmonic. So let's look at that a little bit more. So in a harmonic sequence, the roots of each chord form a pattern of intervals. So in the key of C major, we could form a sequence that starts on C, and then the root moves up a fourth to become F. So we had 1 chord C to a 4 chord F. Then it could go down a third to become D minor. And now we've established a pattern of root moving up a fourth and then root moving down a third. So this pattern will form our sequence. So to make it a sequence, we need to repeat it starting on a different pitch level. So there's our first three chords, C, F, D minor. Now we'll repeat the pattern, and we'll move down from that D minor, up from D minor, up a fourth. So the next chord would be a G, and then the root would move back down by a third to become an E minor. So then our sequence continues. We go D minor, G, E minor. So altogether we have then we could continue. E minor up a fourth becomes A minor, and then A minor down a fourth becomes F, and then we would end on 1 because we're back at 1. So our whole sequence would sound like this. And you can see that it works because it sets up this expectation. Your ear knows, okay, well, the next one would be this. So it kind of drags you along. Even though this model doesn't really make any sense as a circle of fifths progression or a harmonic function model, anything like that, it only works because of that repeated pattern of going up a fourth and going down a third. So sequences can create really strong chord progressions. All right, well, one well-known sequence is the Pachelbel canon progression. And I'll play it and you'll see what I mean. We've heard that everywhere. So again, it's a sequence. So the pattern is a root movement that is repeated over and over again at a different pitch level. And in this case, it's the movement of down a fourth. So the first chord is D. So we go down a fourth to A, and then up a second to B minor. So that forms our sequence pattern. Then it repeats, this time starting on B. Down a fourth to F sharp, and then up a step to G. And then down a fourth to D, and this time it kind of ends. So sequences don't have to be complete either. They can just be part of it. So this sequence pattern repeats until the last two chords. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to use these things. And so harmonic function, circle progressions, and sequences can all be used interchangeably to create chord progressions. In other words, a chord progression doesn't have to follow only one of the models at a time. So your chord progression doesn't have to strictly be a sequence. It doesn't have to strictly be a circle of fifths. It doesn't have to only be a harmonic function, right? In fact, most music uses combinations of these models. So that Pachelbel progression is an example of a progression that starts as a sequence, like we just saw, but then the last 2 or 3 chords use harmonic function as their guide, right? So that one chord is the tonic, and then we need a subdominant chord to follow that, so we'll use 4. Then we need a dominant chord to follow that, which is 5. So it uses the harmonic function model to kind of end the sequence, to kind of turn it around. So here we have a sequence at the beginning and harmonic function at the end. We can do the same thing with our little melody, right? We can combine these. And so for this one, we will start using harmonic function. So we'll move 1 to 4, so 1 to the subdominant. Then from there, we could end it with a circle progression. So from that subdominant chord, we could go to a 2, and then a 5 through circle progression, and then to 1 through the rest of the circle progression. So the whole progression this time would be 1, 4, 2, 5, 1. Okay, which is the third different sequence we've had, right? Third different chord progression we've had with this simple little melody. But each time we've chosen a different model or a combination of models to pick the chords. And that's really what we're doing with this. Okay. And let's talk about our old friend minor finally. So like everything else with minor, it gets a little bit more complicated. But in general, all the models we just saw, harmonic function, sequence, and circle progressions all apply to progressions in minor keys. But in minor, the 3 chord, and this time it's major, is much more important. And that's because the 3 chord in minor is the tonic chord of the relative major key. So if you think about the key of A minor, the 1 chord in A minor is an A minor chord, right? And then the 3 chord is going to be a C major chord. Well, those 2 keys, those 2 chords share a key signature, right? So they are relatives to each other. So in a lot of ways, there's like 2 different tonics in a minor key. So we'll explain that a little bit better here. So here's our map this time of our harmonic function, but we've used all the chords that exist in a minor key instead of a major key. So you'll see that for tonic, we can use the 1 chord or the major 6 chord this time. Dominant chord, still a capital 5, right? Still a 7 diminished, and this time a 1, 6, 4, right? And then our subdominant chords are a minor 4 and a 2 diminished. So we've kind of replaced them with their minor key versions, which is generally what you do. But remember, the 3 chord didn't quite fit into our other model too well. In a minor key, it fits in way better because it is actually a very important part of the key. It's the relative major chord. So it's kind of like a secondary tonic area. So dominant chords can lead to that tonic, and subdominant chords can lead to that tonic as well. And tonic chords can kind of move in between the tonic and the relative major tonic. It's kind of like a secondary tonic area for 3. Which brings up the question of, well, what leads to 3? And that is our real weird chord, which is the 7. Now, this is kind of what I think we talked about in class, but we have 2 different kinds of 7 chords in a minor key, right? One is that 7 diminished, right? Which is built on the raised leading tone of the key. So in the key of C minor, the root of a 7 diminished chord would be B natural, D, F. And that is dominant of the tonic, right? The real tonic. Okay, so 7 to 1 is fine. That works fine in minor. But you also have a 7 chord that's built on the not raised, right? The natural 7th degree of the scale, which in the key of C minor would be a B flat, right? Which is just a major triad. And we use it to lead to that 3 chord, right? So it's kind of like this sideways motion. If you want to get to that 3 tonic, you use the natural 7 major triad of the minor key. Okay, we'll have to explain that a little bit better, but that is generally what you use that 7 for. And 7 can also be part of an extended circle progression. So in minor, if we want to get to the 1 chord, we would use a 5 to get there. We'd use a 2 diminished to get to the 5. We'd use a 6 to get to the 2. We'd use a 3, there's our major 3 again. And then the chord we can use to get to 3 would be the natural 7 chord, right? And so that creates a circle progression that's a little bit longer than it would be in major because we can use that natural 7 triad to get to 3, which then in turn leads all the way down the circle back to 1. Okay. Well, there you go. That is a lot about harmonic function, and we'll talk more and more about it in class, but those are the 3 basic models we want to follow. And the book has more to say too. It kind of goes through each triad and explains, and it has a really pretty good chart, I think, of showing you the different possibilities that kind of combines all what I'm talking about with ideas from the book as well. All right, well, thanks for watching, and I hope that you all have a great day.